From Acres USA, you are listening to the Acres USA podcast, a conversational podcast where we'll explore sustainable farming, regenerative practices, and the latest innovations in eco-agriculture with some of your favorite farmers and ranchers. I'm your host, Taylor Henry, the owner and CEO of Acres USA. Welcome to the Acres USA podcast. All right, so if 300 acres at $5,500 an acre, it's, you're looking at 1.65 million. I gave it a 6% rate at 30 years, and that's probably pretty low right now. If you actually look at, I think right now Fannie Mae's at like 7.5, so usually land runs 0.5% or full percent higher than that if you have good credit.
I think my USDA loan is up closer to 7.5.
Oh, well, that's crazy too. So yeah, even if you do I was gonna say you could do USDA, which is always fun with a lot of paperwork. So let's just say it's 6% because I do think we're gonna get back there at some point in the next 2 years.
Those low rates were a historical anomaly for the last 20 years. For most of U.S. history, interest rates have been where they're at now, or a percent or two higher.
Yeah,
it's like in our generation, What do we believe is normal? It's easy to kind of have this normalcy bias from the 20 or 30 years you and I have been alive as adults and in business.
That's true. I will say, though, with COVID, I think politicians were given this idea that they could fake interest rates for periods of time. It hasn't happened since then, but
we've been doing that since the 70s, brother.
Well, I'm just packed and ready to go when it happens again.
What did we do? We printed like 300% of the money supply in like 3 years or something. That existed in the U.S. Monetary system. That's been one of my big gripes with a lot of my neighbors. A lot of old guys are selling out because they're like, well, cattle prices are high. They're always going to come down again. And I'm like, guys, look at the cattle market. The cattle herd's the smallest it's been since the 1960s. The age of the average rancher is 58 and a half years old and going up, not down. You've got all these dynamics happening where, like heifer retention up until this spring hadn't started yet, and it maybe has started this spring and summer. We'll see when the data really shakes out of where the herds are this year.
The last report went backwards.
When was that?
I feel like I just saw something like a month ago that came out and said that it's still declining.
Good grief. Even this spring? Okay, so...
Yeah, because what you're describing is exactly the issue, is there's so many people selling out that it seems impossible that it's going to get fixed in the next year or two.
Like my neighbors, there's empty land all around me because these old guys are selling the herds thinking cattle prices will come down. And with heifer retention, we know we're nowhere near the market even doing its first bull run in cattle. Like it's not – usually you've got like 2 to 3 years of climbing prices, 2 to 3 years of high prices, and then it comes down again. We've easily got 4 to 6 years of cattle prices significantly going up yet. Like the market is at a bottom. Market's bottom on capitulation. Market's top on mania and everybody and their sister buying cows in their backyard thinking they're going to become a millionaire. We're at the former, not the latter. So I keep trying to explain this to my neighbors. Like, look, guys, we're not measuring the cattle market. We're measuring the dollar. The measuring stick is what changed. And so everything's up. Cocoa is up 200 or 300%. Orange juice is up 200 or 300%. Like everything in the real economy has gone up as much as the money they printed, because when M2 changes, the whole measuring stick changes. And if we want to kind of dial this conversation into what you and I are really wanting to talk about, we're looking at a whole economy where the economy itself is dictated through monetary driven incentives that shape the industry and productive capacity in America more than the productive incentives do. So like Seyfedin Ammous, who wrote the Bitcoin Standard, one of his sayings that I like, he says, in a world of soft money, everything else has to become money. So in the U.S., like land is treated as a store of value. It's a monetary asset. And so land is so expensive because it's being held by wealthy people on their balance sheets as an investment that monetary investment premium is so high that you can't pay for land out of its productivity anymore to actually scale up building farming operations, right? And so this is where that Greg Judy idea came from. If he went bankrupt trying to do mainstream traditional ranching, and he came up with, I'd rather control the land than own the land, because then somebody else is covering the capital cost of the land investment, so he doesn't have to wrestle with the biggest input costs being monetized. So I always explain it like gold. Like, gold is not used for a lot of industrial purposes, for things like electronics or whatever, even when it'd be great for it, because gold's so valuable as a money that its monetary use outcompetes its productive use. And sadly, in agriculture, like, one of the big themes we're seeing that happen in the land itself. And so you can look at history at other places where, like, some other ways I'd explain this. Like Holland. Have you heard the term Dutch disease before?
No.
Okay, so Dutch disease is this economics term. So my degree's in business econ. I'm kind of like a nerd that's an entrepreneur that farms. that drives my background, maybe even more than farming does. For your audience, while we're talking, my ranch is an ultra high density grazing ranch. We graze Johann Zeitzman style. Zeitzman. We're on the ground doing this. We've got we'll be up to probably 500 head counting calves. Smaller cattle, we're probably at 350 or 360 animal units. Growing fast. We'll be hopefully 2 or 3 times that in the next 4 or 5 years. Grew from 13 cows in 2022, so tech company growth rates in the brass tacks world of farming, which has been challenging. So, like, I've got experience on the ground talking about this as a farmer, even though I'm a bit of a kind of big picture economics nerd as well. But so Dutch disease. Dutch disease comes from history in Holland. They discovered oil. The government decided they were going to invest in extracting the oil, and then the profits from the oil was going to be given as universal basic income to the citizens in Holland. Their thinking was that would lead into this giant blossoming of just productivity. You'd have entrepreneurs and artisans and creators and inventors, and it would lead to this giant kind of financial bloom of everything being awesome because you have extra energy being injected in the economy. What ended up happening was actually the opposite. It deindustrialized them, and it stagnated everything. Part of that's cultural, because when you don't have to actually go out there and create in order to have value, you get rid of the incentives for people to put in the work. Part of that is monetary, where this is what always happens in these situations where you have wealth coming into a nation or empire. So like us in the U.S., the way I'd explain it is we discovered the natural resource that we could export dollars to the world, just like Holland was exporting oil to the world. And so in the U.S., our economy has kind of stepped from being this productive agriculture economy and manufacturing economy earlier in American history. And Wendell Berry kind of talks about the agriculture collapse, probably the best of anybody I've read. And then after that, you had the industrial and manufacturing collapse in America. And now we're just basically a financial service economy that doesn't create or produce anything anymore. And so, like, you've also got stacked on top of that Triffin's dilemma. Have you ever heard of that term?
Yeah, I just heard about it when I was researching your previous podcast
with working cows. Okay, so Triffin's dilemma for your audience. It's this idea that when you're the world reserve currency, it's this exorbitant privilege, but also an exorbitant cost, because the world needs your money in order to interact with each other in doing trade. And so you're exporting dollars to the world, but it forces you into a trade imbalance so that you can get your money into the world so that they have the good they need to exchange for your actual currency for them to participate in the world trade. And it forces a trade imbalance. And what that trade imbalance causes is you've got a strong currency compared to everybody else because everybody wants your currency to use it. And if you crunch the numbers, you end up landing somewhere arguably around a 30%, like basically advantage of currency games. And so as a producer, one of the dynamics in the beef industry we have to deal with in the U.S. is cheap imported beef. And like I've talked to some producers down in South America that I'm friends with, like Johann Zeitzman's chat group. And they're always saying like, well, U.S. producers just need to get more efficient. And I'm like, well, buddy, like it doesn't really work that way. I mean, let's ignore the monetization of land in the U.S. Let's just put that to the side. Let's purely look at trade imbalance. Your animals are being sold into the U.S. marketplace about 30% cheaper than mine, purely because of the strength of the U.S. dollar and Triffin's dilemma. What farm, ranch, small business in general has a 30% premium they can just stomach swallowing so that they can still be profitable and compete on the stage of the world, right? It just, you've got these layers and layers of dynamics stacked on top of that that are causing this just consistent collapse of productivity in America. I mean,
what gets them to be able to have that production cost being so low?
It's not production costs, it's purely currency games.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
It's because the world needs dollars. And so because of the world needing dollars, with the US being the world reserve currency, they're selling animals in a currency that is underweighted against US currency. And so it's just like if you want to get rich and retire to Mexico, right? Like you don't have to have a big savings account to go just live like a rich person on a beach. Mm-hmm. That same dynamic happens when goods are being brought into the US. And so, because that's why the US has devolved down to this just consumer economy, right? Because we can buy things cheap and we have this really high standard of living, not based upon the US being competitive as producers in the world, but just based upon the fact that we have this economic advantage of the world reserve currency that in a lot of ways we take our standard of living for granted. And that doesn't last forever. And that's a good thing for people who want to be entrepreneurs and value producers and creators, because it actually hurts us. Now, in the short term, they'll be paying as the world shifting away from the dollar and kind of going more multipolar. And I mean, that's all tied to faith in the US of like what's going to even be something that can replace the dollar, which is a whole other conversation. But we know, like we just had, I think it was a week or two ago, a situation where there was a government bond sale and there were no buyers for U.S. bonds. And so the Treasury bought them all. That right there is a symptom that we're near the end game of that advantage of a consumer economy, to where that ability to buy things cheap in the world is collapsing because people are not putting the same faith in the U.S. dollar as previously. And you can see that with us getting downgraded in our credit ratings in a nation and things too. And so this all connects back to part of why ranching is so economically unfeasible in the U.S.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, so we were talking about a land purchase that you guys were either considering and you ran the numbers on. You said 300 acres at $5,500 an acre, comes out to $1.65 million. That's $10,000 a month for a payment at 30 years at 6%. Not counting taxes, not counting infrastructure. Was the infrastructure there, fencing, water?
I've got you loud and clear. Some of it was there. It would definitely need some updating. The ponds would need cleaning out, things like that.
So you're probably looking at like a 10.5 a month. Because what would be taxes on 300 acres?
Oh man, probably with agriculture tax deductions in Oklahoma, probably $3,000 a year. Taxes really aren't bad for an agriculture operation.
Yeah, so I mean, still you're probably at that. So 10.5.
What are you coming out to as far as your yearly land carry costs of those interest rates for say like that 30-year mortgage?
Well, you're at $10,000 a month, so $120,000 a year to cover your costs. And if you said you can run 80 cows at that average of $800 of profit per cow, that's only $64,000.
So you're almost $60,000 in the hole every single year.
Yeah, I mean, so like my argument somewhat on land, I mean, I am a realtor, is that you have that, you are in a sense sticking money into a savings account that is better than a normal savings account. But still, I mean, the idea would be that how do we get back to the point of producers being able to, not only pay for the land, but then have enough after to make a living on it.
Agreed.
And obviously we're not anywhere close on that.
I read somewhere previously, I don't remember if this was accurate. I didn't dig into the research behind the article, but the article was saying that the average ranch in the U.S. loses 1.5% return on assets per year if you don't factor land equity appreciation.
Yeah.
And, I mean, you look across the industry, and that makes sense. I think 17,000 ranches a year go out of business and has been happening for the last 45 years in the U.S. There's been this massive consolidation of the industry, and where a lot of these multi-generational farms are just piecing up their land and selling it off slowly over time. So we've ended up in this position where 89% of the ranches in the U.S. are less than 100 cows. Of that grouping, the average herd size is 22 animals. And so most of those operations are hobby farms. Somebody has a city job, and they're subsidizing their farming habit. And that's not good for American food security or the future of ranching as an industry. I mean, the age of the average rancher in the U.S. is 58 and a half years old. I was reading a statistic earlier this week. Guess what the average age of a home buyer is in America right now?
I'm sure it's close to 30 now.
It's mid-50s.
First-time home buyer?
Just home buyers in general doing home buying transactions.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay, gotcha.
The average age...
No, I mean, that makes sense.
The average age of the transactions are mid-50s now. And that's basically post the housing crisis and the bank bailouts of, like, the debt industry in the U.S. Housing prices have never been, like, adjusted to reality again. And the young generation just got left behind. I mean, you've got those charts that show productivity versus wages. Wages haven't come up basically for a year in mine's whole generation. And so everything's monetized, everything's gotten really expensive with asset inflation. It just ran away from us. So you've got a whole generation that wants to participate in a capital-intensive industry of ranching. Land's monetized. Cows are a hard asset that trade on ETFs where, like, they're an inflation hedge. The price of cattle has gotten crazy. I mean, for our operation, I mean, we're talking, we bought 700 acres of land and, I don't know, 400 head of cattle. And we've probably got $5.5–6 million worth of assets we had to pull together in order to build out this operation. And this is why the age of the average rancher keeps running up and up and up. It's an industry that no longer is economically viable, and that's a problem as a nation. And there's the macroeconomic things behind that, but then you've also got, which is one of Acres U.S.A.'s biggest focuses, right, is the regenerative stuff. We've had a history of soil erosion basically from really from the founding America on. But it has periods where it's kind of accelerated. You can kind of look at the patterns. Thomas Jefferson even wrote, you may know this, that the quest to go west was actually a quest for soil fertility because the cropping on the East Coast, even in the early plantation times of America, was eroding soil so quickly, doing the more European-type farming practices of plowing, that people were going west to find soil. And so, like, one of my favorite books is written by a guy named David Montgomery. It's Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations. And he tracks the patterns of societies through the lens of the soil. Societies that invest in their soil fertility flourish generation after generation. And whether you're looking at, like, the Aztecs, the Romans, the Chinese, like, all these different societies, what happens is when a society starts extracting from its soil fertility rather than building it, they usually collapse within a generation. And so you can kind of look at that in American history, right? We went west. We had this huge inheritance of fertility in the Great Plains that was built by the bison. And I would argue even the management of the Native Americans. They had kind of more of a permaculture type ecology system of how they practiced food, both of how they managed the bison herds and did control burns and even like food forests and things. Like the Europeans got here and they thought it was like Eden, but that wasn't accidental. Like that's one of my big gripes with modern conservationism is so many people approach it with this Malthusian mindset of humans are a virus and that nature flourishes when we remove ourselves. But that's not true. Nature degrades. We are the keystone species that have to steward it, which is a commission from God from the Garden of Eden onward. And we have to have an intentionality of doing our role for the flourishing of the ecology and the earth. But so we went west. We ended up using up the soil in the Great Plains and all that. And you snap forward to like the 1930s, you had the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl happen at the same time, which always does. You have ecological like turmoil, and then you have economic turmoil. They always go hand in hand. But what ended up happening is we had the World War. We printed a bunch of government money to go win the war, got everybody kind of back on their feet doing things to kind of go win. And then Earl Butz and that whole turn of post-World War, we took the factories producing nitrogen for bombs and all these things, and we turned that and brought that home of like food as a weapon was the narrative from the government at that time of let's just pump those things into the soil to produce more food to make us a powerhouse on the world stage. And that was a short-term mindset where we were able to use our strength as a nation and our military prowess to basically it was moving towards the petrodollars how we got there. And you carry that forward to like the 1930s to the 1970s where we left the gold standard, right? What we ended up doing is we just robbed the world by giving them dollars we didn't actually back, which is our transition towards world reserve currency post the world wars. And that enabled us to have cheap energy to sustain subsidizing our lack of soil fertility. So that bought us, say, 40 years from the 30s to the 70s. That's one generation. And then we had basically just betrayed the whole world when we left the gold standard and basically just robbed every nation that was using dollars. And that put us on the petrodollar standard where we now have to use military might to enforce the dollar and enforce cheap energy. And that cheap energy has been what shaped farming basically since the 30s, where we're pumping in petroleum products of fertilizers in the soil to overcome our poor management. But that's accelerated where it takes more and more energy to sustain production that has higher and higher input costs because we've left our role as co-authors with the ecology, co-authors with the soil biology, co-authors with nature, to where there's this synergistic production where abundance is increasing to where we're treating soil as a machine, and that doesn't work. Eventually it devolves, right? So that is a place where we're reaching now in agriculture in America, these just challenges with pests, challenges with disease. And this is where John Kemp is pushing the world forward of returning to understanding plant metabolism and plant health and the connection between soil and soil biology with pest and disease resistance. And we're having to put more and more effort in to keep production up. And that's causing more and more economic pressure on farming and more health issues on farmers. And we have all these negative health externalities that have destroyed both small local communities, but also the health of the food itself being sold in the marketplace. I mean, that's how I got into farming, because I had health issues. I started going down the path of like, okay, just mainstream medicine's not helping me. I had like Crohn's disease type stuff. So like getting into alternative health and nutrition, you just chase that question. Like, why is the food not nutrient dense anymore? Well, the soil's eroded and the soil's not biologically diverse. We don't have the diversity of plant species and ecology anymore, which correlates to the nutrient density of the food, which correlates to human health. And I believe there's connections between soil biology and the human biome of like just natural health, mental health, because the brain's so connected to the gut. And the layers of those things connect together to where soil health, human health, and cultural health of a nation all kind of collapse. And so in the US, we've tied these things together and subsidized our way out of the problem using basically imperialistic tyranny through the US dollar system to overcome the problems. But now we have a whole industry of regenerative agriculture waking up and realizing this doesn't last forever. We need to go back to being stewards again. But everybody is young, unable to afford land, unable to afford getting started farming. And we're all doing things at a tiny scale, trying to break out to make it work. and pumping our hearts and souls into this and having challenges scaling that to an industry-wide impact. I mean, what is the percent of grass-fed beef in the market of the beef industry in the U.S.? It's like less than 8%, right?
Yeah.
It's tiny. It may even be less than that. I don't remember. It's
And then
8% in my brain from somewhere, but
what of that is imported?
That's a good question, because a huge chunk of that's coming from New Zealand, Argentina, and it's a lot of like lower quality lean beef rather than actually quality beef.
Hey everybody, hope your spring and summer is going well for you. We have 2 summer events that we want to make sure that we talk about. Number 1, June 21st in Gaston, Indiana at Jason Mock's farm. John Kempf, Gary Zimmer, Jason Mock will be speaking at our first annual Farm Weird on Farm event. It is June 21st, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Half the day will be presentations, and then the other half the day we'll get out in the field and actually see a live harvest, see some of Jason's relay cropping, in-crop grazing, perennial systems. Jason's got a really incredible farm, and we're excited to be out there. The other event is July 11th, and is our second annual Viroqua on Farm event. It'll be in Viroqua, Wisconsin, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Our speakers for that are Will Winter, Steve Campbell, Gary Zimmer, and Brian Dotery from Understanding Ag. And this one we will talk about livestock, regenerative grazing techniques, holistic animal health, and grazing economics. Head to the description. We'll have links for both events in there, and we hope to see you at one of these events this summer. So, I mean, yeah, it's not an ideal scenario. I guess the way I look at it is, I think there is more opportunity now. I know people don't like hearing this, but there's more opportunity now to have that so city job, but then also be, on the farm, being able to do everything you're doing. I mean, similar to what I'm doing. I'm doing a classic city job. Acres U.S.A. would have never been able to be ran out of my 60-acre homestead here in a shed before. It wasn't feasible. But because of technology now, we can do, everything that we can do and be in this small town in Wisconsin, and still gives me, the ability to farm. But we set up our operation in a way that, I'm not by any means a full-time farmer, but I think that opportunity is there for people, even though it isn't what we really want to hear about.
Agreed. But this conversation, like, the key point is production should be profitable. And we live in a situation that currently isn't. And that's a problem, because one of the big trickle-on effects of that is only crazy people do it. And there's this brain drain that's happened from the industry where all the really high competence, high capability people end up going into investment banking and trading meme coins in the financialized economy, because that's where the money is. And this is why I love the people that choose to stay on the ground, because they just love it. It's hugely needed. They're making sacrifices to do it. That's everywhere from guys like you to John Kemp to Elaine Ingham, Christine Jones, or my guys on the ground ranching with me, and everybody trying to build farms that do this. But a lot of us don't understand why that is. And understanding why that is important for understanding how to change that. And so I dug into some of this macro stuff in that podcast on working cows, where we talked about Triffin's dilemma and what Trump's trying to do with the tariffs to help kind of fix that trade imbalance U.S. currency issue, to bring production back into America. And
so before we get on that, let me just throw this stat out since we talked about it. It says 4 to 5% of the U.S. beef sales are around grass-fed, which is valued at approximately $3 billion a year. But 75 to 80% of the labeled grass-fed beef sold in the U.S. is imported.
Wow. So call that a quarter. So 1% of grass-fed beef in America is produced in America. A quarter of 3 or 4%. Yeah. So rounding up, that's a little heartbreaking.
Yeah.
There's
I mean, it shows it is a value added product. I mean, it is a unique product in some way. And as the health concerns that you've talked about and people start realizing it, the education is a lot more available to folks now. So you can in theory then you should be able to ask a premium. You're producing 1% of a product.
Agreed.
And that bill that passed, that I know it takes about 2 years for it to cycle through, but that's going to help a lot with the imported beef not being able to be labeled as created in the U.S.
Agreed. Yeah, that's the misinformation in the marketplace is a big problem because the consumer, and this is one of those things that's just really frustrating in the industry, is there's so much consumer momentum and like just energy around healthy food, grass-fed beef, regenerative farming. Yet a lot of that's not making it all the way to the ground for the farmers. I mean, that's anywhere from the labeling issues you're talking about to just like what happened with organic. It got captured by corporate interests and doesn't really mean that much anymore. And we see that in the regenerative and the grass-fed industry as well. Like a bookmark on the conversation talking about, we'll talk about this in a little later, but the like state of grass-fed beef in America and how that actual product and industry is working is a huge conversation. So we've got all this pressure economically against production, the huge capital costs. You've also got regulatory burdens in the processing industry, which is something that's pretty more talked about in a lot of these conversations. Um, like the monopoly, like four companies, corporations control what is it, like 75 or 80% of processing, and they keep increasing regulations. Like they're trying to push that wastewater stuff on small processors now, which is like $1.5 million of infrastructure cost on a company that, like my local processor, he does 10 cows a week, so he's probably just pure revenue making. What is that? He's charging
10. He's processing 10 a week.
Yeah, like my small local processor.
Well, if it's similar to mine, then he'd be making $1,000
yeah,
per
so you're
animal, so
talking 10
10,000
grand a
a month,
week, so that's
or
half a mil a
10,000 a month.
year in revenue. That's not even profit, and so it's like he can't carry those costs of these extra regulatory burdens, which are all just being pushed by the lobbyist interest for the very sake of pushing the small guys out.
And is
that
that if
shapes
he wants to stay USDA certified? So if he wanted to go just state certified, would he have to do that?
Probably not. A lot of the states try to follow USDA recommendations in their certification processes anyways. So that kind of gets kind of hairy because like we're supposed to have a federalist system where you don't get cornered, but we end up cornered in most cases, even though we're like that's not the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
And so, like, then you have these big corporate bullies of the processors. They want giant carcasses to maximize their own profitability. But as we know in the grazing world, you want a smaller frame cow for grass efficiency. That way, the maintenance energy is lower. You don't have to have all these input costs of high energy feeds like grains because we've spent, I don't know, 40 years breeding cattle to be pigs because of the economic incentives pushed by this monopoly processing industry. So there's just all these layers of problems that need solving, right? And so, like, in the macro sense, we've got the positive stuff Trump's trying to do with the tariffs. We also have conversations around what's happening with the dollar and the world reserve currency. And this is where I also think, like, the strategic Bitcoin reserve conversation Trump's having is also interesting because if we pull the dollar out of this spot of primacy on the world stage as a reserve currency, it hurts us as a consumer economy, but it actually benefits us as a producer economy, just like he's trying to do a reindustrialize in America. And so returning to hard money, whether you're talking a gold standard, a Bitcoin standard, a multipolar world where the US is not the only liquid like monetary unit being used for trade, would be good for producers in America. But then, like, the part of the conversation that I really get excited about is just returning to balanced systems of regenerative processes and what that actually does for production. So doing Johann Zeitzman style ultra high density grazing. Um, the standard carry capacity that we can carry of cows per acre, because of the efficiency of grazing and the efficiency of grass recovery and the long term building of stable carbon in the soil and the like diversity of plants and the bricks level coming up, which is just way better for average daily gains, you can carry about 3 to 4 times the number of animal units per acre than a commercial set stock operation can. And so we have hope of these macroeconomic situations improving, which should help the monetization of the land and all those other problems. But what we can control on the ground is just being more efficient. And that requires long time horizons. It requires you being able to be patient and stomach booting up the ecological flywheel. Like an easy way I explain this would be, say, when you first take over a piece of land, we need cattle that are hardy enough not just to graze like their wild ruminant ancestors, where they're grazing intensively and non-selectively in tightly packed mobs like the bison would do, where they'd move through the Midwest, and like you read the journals of Lewis and Clark and the early settlers in America, like oxen and horses would starve if they got caught behind a herd of buffalo because there was nothing left to eat. And then it would rest for a long time. They'd migrate with the seasons and come back and graze it again, right? And having animals hardy enough to do that, they don't really exist because the modern Angus has just been bred for being an animal that is taken care of with medical inputs of antiparasites, vaccines, and antibiotics or whatever to keep them healthy and alive. They're not environmentally adapted to anything, whether it's insect disease or parasite stress. And they're large frame because the processors have driven us that direction. So they're not actually efficient as grazers because their maintenance energy requirements are so high. You have to give them surplus energy through high value feeds. And that high value feed can be not just cheap grain imports subsidized by cheap energy and cheap fertilizers, which creates low quality food and negative externalities of health and environmental outcomes, but like even say like set stocking. Set stocking cattle puts less stress on cattle because they can wander around and eat the highest sugar and highest protein, highest quality feeds. And that's an advantage for an unadapted animal. But you take those animals and you try to put them in a system where they're grazing more intensively and non-selectively, they don't have that advantage. And thus, they struggle to maintain body condition. They struggle to maintain fertility. And so we have to have animals that not only can behave like their wild ruminant ancestors, which we have to breed, which takes time, but they also have to handle even more stress. So when we first take over a property, the ecology is broken. There's no soil biology to break down manure. There's no dung beetles to bury manure. The population of wildlife and birds are low. So like that first 2 or 3 years in our operation, the fly load was enormous because there's no natural ecology in place like there would have been in the wild. And there's all sorts of things we did to manage that, right? Like we released those little predator flies that they use at horse barns that go out. They're like little gnats that they lay eggs in the cow pies, and those larvae kill the fly larvae. Or like we inoculated dung beetles by releasing them to help speed up the reproduction of them getting back into the ecology. Or like we put garlic salt out for them to help decrease the fly load naturally. Or like we would even move like fly trap bags in the grazing lanes behind the herds, right? But the stress on the cattle was enormous during those first couple years. And that's really hard to stomach. And so like what a lot of guys do is they'll use like Cydectin in their mineral in order to control the fly load so that the cows actually can maintain enough health to breed back for their own profitability. The problem there is, even though Cydectin's quote unquote dung beetle safe, it's harming that kickstarting of the ecology of the soil biome, of the insect biome, of all these things. And it's even hurting the in utero adaptation of the next generation of cattle. 50% improvement of epigenetics happens each generation. If you take away the stressor using medical care, you basically are just spinning your tires and not really moving forward each generation. So you have to be willing to stomach that. So you see that in lower fertility, lower breedback, lower body conditions, slower weight gains. And having long time horizons to get to that what's promised at like ultra high density grazing, that 3 or 4 times increased carry capacity, you've got to stomach 3 to 5 years of production being lower in order to get there. And that once again is an economic challenge. What ranch can handle that? Like us trying to develop genetics here at our ranch, I always explain to people that you've got your commercial cattle and then like Pharaoh Angus are becoming pretty popularized. They're supposed to be like this lower input, lower medical or parasite resistant type cattle, right? And we all know there's a pretty big difference between a commercial cow and a pharogenetics animal. Trying to really push into efficient grazing, ecologically balanced grazing with this high density stuff we're doing, the magnitude of difference of genetics of animal I need is almost again that same magnitude from a commercial cow to a farrow cow, from a farrow cow to the kind of cows I'm trying to raise. It's that big of a shift. So, like, we brought in our base genetic stock was Piney Woods. They're the early American cow. They're one of the first two cows brought into North America with the early settlers. There's Spanish woods and swamp cows that were just basically released in North America. They never got modernized. They were kept down the swamps and the woods of the Gulf Coast. Even as late as the 1950s, they weren't being treated with any anti-parasites or medical care or feed. Like in a lot of cases, the farmers would just cut their fences and let them run wild in the swamps. They put a salt block in their backyard. The cows that came home in spring were the cows that were next year's herd. So super hardy. And then we're running a composites on top of that we're building. So I've got bulls I went all around the country and the world trying to find the best unimproved genetics of diversity that we could run on top of those to kind of beef them up a bit, but also add some more adaptation to them. So I've got Mashona, I've got Obrock, I've got Thule, I've got some Murray Gray, I've got some Old Line Angus, I've got some South Pole. And then I'm just breeding that using fertility as the catch-all, because if their parasite stressed, if their environment's stressed with heat or cold, if they're like not hormonally balanced, like anything will be caught by fertility and not breed back. And so just using that to crank the handle and develop our genetics. But our cull rates have been enormous. So like I've trialed Piney Woods, I've tried Corriente, I've tried Faro Angus, I've tried South Pole, I've tried old lineage triple purpose milking Devons, I've tried Mexican Criollo. My South Pole or my Piney Woods, my cull rate's been about 20%. Corriente, my cull rate was about 50%. The milking Devons, my cull rate's going to end up probably being 80 to 90%. The Criollo, I'll probably land at 50 or 60%. The South Pole, I've probably culled 80% of them. The Faro Angus, I culled 80 or 90% of them. And once again, like stomaching that hurts. Like I lost money on all the ones I culled, but you have to start somewhere to build it. Like I only know
when you call, are you taking them to the finish line and selling them as meat, or are you actually just selling them back?
So my goal has been to ride that line carefully, of leaving them in the system to see if I can get them to bounce back. And we've learned a lot about managing animal health in that process. And our system puts a lot of pressure on animals. I mean, we're grazing at 650 to 850,000 pounds to an acre. So I've got 315-ish animal units right now, and we're calving, so I'm not pushing them as hard. Stacked at about a half an acre per section, moving them on 4 to 5 sections per day, and then grazing it. Currently during calving, we're grazing at probably 80 to 85% utilization. But typically, maybe sometimes even 75% if the weather's kind of rough. But usually I'm trying to push 90% utilization for the good of the land. I guess Johan says that a cow has two purposes. She's the keystone of ecological management and food. And so she's got to be able to do both. The more adapted and resilient the cow is, the stronger lever arm they are to push hard on grazing, because the more intense you graze the land in short periods of time, the better the succession of species is. And then the more efficient the grazing is, the more we can afford to rest more of the property to get more root exudate production and more diversity built up through long rest periods, right? But what we've learned is that when I'm bringing animals into this sort of a system, it takes about 6 months to get them trained to grazing at density and kind of get them somewhat used to it. It takes about 18 months to find their stride. And we'll see a lot of animals stress for those first 6 to 18 months. And it's pretty shocking the numbers that will actually bounce back. But it's hard to tell because you're pushing that edge of like which ones will bounce back and which ones won't. And there's no way to really know, but just to kind of fly close to the sun and just see what happens. And we've really gotten dialed in, thankfully, after we're on our 4th year doing this. Like, I've become really convinced. We were talking about Albrecht earlier before we hopped on recording, that a lot of the issues I'm seeing are actually mineral balance issues. I think parts of what's happening is actually they're detoxing glyphosate. I've gotten really, really into the weeds on making sure I don't have hidden glyphosate inside of my inputs. Like, I was using Free Choice Enterprises as one of my mineral mixes. Free Choice Enterprises uses rice hulls as their flow agent. Rice hulls are high in glyphosate residue. I was using really expensive chelated vitamin probiotic molasses licks to support the animals during the endoc phase. And molasses, if it's not organic, is high in glyphosate residue. So I was seeing like copper and trace mineral imbalances. And so getting all that cleaned up, getting a good mineral program has definitely helped the animals adapt faster. Getting really good about knowing where that edge is, about where an animal's probably going to bounce back and adapt, where they're not. So my goal has always been to put them under pressure, give them a chance to prove themselves and adapt. If they can't, pull them out, like give them some natural care, fatten them up and sell them for beef. But a lot of them have just ended up where they're either dumped at the sale barn, or I've had a high level of death losses of just trying to push this edge, which is not surprising when you're really trying to do something new and learn about it.
So two things on that. So we had 2 podcasts we did with Will Winter. The second podcast we had with him, Steve Campbell was with, and they both talk about frame, and Will dives heavily into the mineralization of cattle. And he mentioned the same thing about FCE. That's who I had. Our mineral feeder was filled by them at one point. But have you used the clay to help deter some of that glyphosate or deter some of the issues that are in the water?
Yeah, so we do some biochar mixed with salt. I do have in the Free Choice mineral box a clay-based product as well. I went over to a company called Advanced Biological Concepts that has a 12-choice mineral selection. Then I added a couple other things to it, like one of them is a clay, like absorptive type product. Their product's really good. It's super bioavailable. It's pretty pricey. But the animal health outcomes I'm seeing are so much better. I'm having animals adapt and bounce back faster that I wasn't seeing previously, which is making it worth it for me.
And then did you ever see Don Huber's latest study where they were actually feeding in feedlots raw sauerkraut, and they believe it's combating the glyphosate?
That doesn't surprise me. I've been having a lot of conversations recently with Kenneth Hamilton, who's been pushing forward fermented feed science, and both like soil biology, but also just a fermented process for finishing animal or for like dairy animals. His inoculant actually processes and breaks down petroleum products, herbicides. Like, he'll take something that tests high, put it into the fermentation process, and basically just tests 0 at the end of the process. He can take stuff that has myco and aflatoxins and show it completely breaks down through the fermentation process. So we're going to start using that. I'm going to do my first batch of haylage this spring and summer, and then I'll start feeding it this fall. And the natural probiotics from feeding that feed helps make the animals more resilient as well. We also do C90 mineral brines. That was a huge jump forward for us. I just never really understood before the difference between doing the mineral as a liquid versus as a solid. The bioavailability is so much higher. I don't necessarily understand why, but it just is. When we went over to doing the C90 mineral brines, our pink eye issue dropped by like 90 to 95% within a week. It was just nearly instantaneous. So that's made a big difference as well. Anything else on those questions or topics? Or back to the main thread?
Are you using any apple cider vinegar?
I've not. I've considered it. I'll probably start mixing that in with the C90 brines at some point. It's just something I've not added in operationally. I believe that it's useful.
So that's another big. Steve Campbell sources it up at the orchards they have in his area. I noticed a difference in our poop while feeding hay after 2 days of giving apple cider vinegar. They were digesting it way better. I'd say it's just all these things are are great. It's a matter of, implementing them into the system. Part of it's like we had gotten this system to where everything was moved by hand, water, mineral, and then we moved into the, the 20-way mineral choice feeder. Well, then now you need something to drag that and move it to the next paddock. Then you add in the apple cider vinegar, which isn't that easy to get into your water in the summer. Obviously it's an option if you make that baleage to spray it before you, put it all into a baleage. But yeah, so I think a lot of these things work, but it's just you're adding more stuff to the operation too.
Yeah, which has definitely been a challenge for me to figure out how to implement. I mean, there's a difference between doing this stuff with like 30 or 40 head versus trying to do it when you've got 500. It's a whole different logistics ball game, and that adds into one of my other big challenges is just the labor force. The labor market in blue collar America is just gutted. There's just nobody, and that's a big challenge for ranches or even just any sort of trade skill and company right now. But yeah, I hear you on the apple cider vinegar. I'll probably gonna need to accelerate implementing that here. I've been thinking about it, just hadn't pushed it as a priority. So, but
Some of these things I do think like with ours, I almost think that scale would help us to make sure that, because then it would just, if you need to add this every week, where sometimes at a smaller scale it'd be like, well, you don't actually have to have it for like a month, and then it gets thrown, it doesn't get maybe replenished like it should right away. That's what my issue with the 20-way mineral feeder is. Like sometimes, you don't look at it, you don't have a big enough herd where you're consuming it where it's like every week needs to be replenished. It's more like once a month, and then one, mineral doesn't get replenished in time, and you start noticing a little bit of, more fly load, or, in the winter we notice, more of a lice issue. But then when we get those mineral feeders filled and properly maintained, those things go away.
Agreed. One of my challenges has been building up the farm. We started on a standard commercial operation, and I did not have any of the typical infrastructure or equipment you have when you start a ranch. And so not only did I have to cover the pain of the cost of the land and then the cost of acquiring the animals, but we had to stomach like getting tractors, getting trucks, getting hay trailers, getting UTVs, like all that stuff adds up. And you got to just kind of be really cunning about what you buy when. And like, we don't have water infrastructure as far as water lines. They're drinking out of just a muddy pond, common water spot. Right. And so like the brines, I either have to use my tractor or a flatbed truck to drive down IBC totes to fill up like a trough that I put next to the water corridor where they're walking by it. Right. And I didn't have a truck. So like, that's like, and I like a truck that could handle that kind of weight with delivering like 600 plus gallons at a time, because they drink it so fast, even with high ratio of salt. But we're slowly getting to where I actually have setups and equipment to be able to handle these sorts of things. And that takes us back to the original thread of stomaching the capital cost, stomaching the time horizons of transitioning to regenerative systems and the turbulence that goes with the transition periods. And how do we do that? I mean, like Jaime Elizondo, who's fairly well known now, he talks on Facebook about the Total Grazing Program, grazing consultant. He says that the economically viable scale for a true cow-calf operation in the U.S. is 500 head. And so most of the industry, we were just saying 89% of ranches are under 100 cows. The average size of those ranches is 22 cows. So getting to that scale in order to be economically viable is really difficult. So for us, we knew we wanted to forerun like regenerative practices and principles and this ultra high density thing. I mean, I know like 6 ranches in the US doing high density, building genetics and doing it on perennial pasture like we're doing. Like it's really small world right now doing these kinds of grazing practices. And I knew we wanted to push the edge there. I knew we wanted to build genetics. And to have the volume of animals to do genetics, you need to have a lot of just land, a lot of animals to just pump into the system. I mean, say I've got 1,000 head, say 20% of those females actually breed 2+3. So in Johann's terminology, a 2+3 cow is one that, while under all the pressure of the system, she breeds at 14 or 15 months, calves before she turns 2, breeds back, calves again before she turns 3, weans both of those calves at 50% of her body weight. I keep bulls intact from all those moms. Okay, so say 20% of my moms in 1,000 cow herd, which I don't even have. That's 200 moms. okay, say half the calves are male. So I keep 100 bulls out of that system. And then say I run a multi-sire program with my yearling bulls, do a DNA test to see which one of those yearling bulls sire the most calves. And so say I keep, which will probably end up being, say, 20% of those bulls. So at a 1,000 cow herd, I've got 20 bulls to select genetics out of. Like that's a small number. Like you're talking 2%. If you don't have volume of cattle, you can't do genetic selection and development. So what we did that was really unique is we understood the economic challenges, and we decided rather than trying to build a small ranch on our own, and we also wanted to own the land. It's a challenge. I mean, Greg Judy's got this whole idea of control the land rather than own it because of the monetization of the land and the price and the carry cost. If you run the numbers, owning the land is about 20 times more expensive than leasing land, which basically takes it $800 per year per head and makes it negative by about $1,000 per year. And so we wanted to own the land. Out of the 6 ultra high density farms in the U.S. I knew of the last 2 years, 2 of them lost their land. And so I ended up buying out their herds. And so that's really painful, and you got to be willing to stomach that process. So what we did that was really different is we built a different system of approaching farming and the economics of it. The story of how we got there is kind of cool. If you got time to talk about that, to tell like where the idea came from too.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I was basically just graduated college in 2013. My background of experience is kind of weird, like a lot of just small business, blue collar trade stuff. My degree was in business econ. I interned with a physicist who creates new technologies, and I got to be a part of him doing fundraising and like going through like hostile takeover attempts of his tech and company IP, and then getting bought out by these giant multinational corporations and kind of getting products to market. I was with him for like 10 years. I learned so much. So I've got this kind of weird background of like a business econ mind, lots of kind of blue collar small business experience, and this kind of larger like venture capital high speed tech startup world from interning and spending so much time with that guy. And so in 2019 I was basically just average middle class, break even net worth. One of my buddies and I owned a carpentry company doing high end fencing in Hampton Roads area, so like wood privacy, black vinyl or black aluminum type stuff, and some of their like fancy neighborhoods in like Williamsburg and things like that. And we ended up getting an opportunity of doing a fence quote for a lady in Suffolk, Virginia. She had a recreational horse farm, and recreational horse farms do not count as ag. So she had lost her tax deduction on her land, and it was eating her alive trying to actually pay for the land. And so she wanted to lease land to a farmer, and everybody around who wanted to lease the land wanted to do cotton or soy and spray a bunch of chemical. And she didn't want that. And so while we were doing a fence quote for her, we just got to talking. She's like, man, I really wish I could find one of those young people who wants to do like what Joel Salatin talks about, like lease some land cheap, and then they do regenerative grazing for the good of the land around here, and then like they make their money on the farming. And I was like, I'd love to do that. Because as a young person, I'd always dreamed of wanting to do regenerative grazing one day. But I was like, well, I got to live my whole life. I got to make a career and make money. And then maybe one day when I'm like 50 or 60 years old, I'll be rich enough to be able to subsidize a farming hobby. And that opportunity just showed up, and it was providential, and I knew I had to take it. And I didn't have any money for cattle. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I just was like, I feel like this is something I'm called to, and it's the right thing. So I signed the lease with her for 28 acres for $1 a year. And I was hanging out on Twitter at the time. I had just kind of joined Twitter because I had discovered Bitcoin. And this was back when Bitcoin was like $4,000 or $5,000, and all the people who knew about Bitcoin were on Twitter. So I was hanging out there trying to learn about it. And so as we know now, Bitcoin went from $4,000 or $5,000 to $69,000 from like 2019, 2020. And since I was hanging out on Twitter, my Twitter account grew with it as kind of all that Bitcoin excitement happened. And so I had 2 very providential things happen at once. One, I caught the Bitcoin bull run, which was awesome. I just knew it was going to happen. I took every penny of debt, every penny I owned, and dumped it into Bitcoin at about $6,000. And my Twitter account really grew. And so I was hanging out on Twitter, and I had a wealthy Wall Street guy DM me. He's like, hey, this little grazing project you're talking about, I want to be a part of this. I was like, no, you don't. I'm using heritage breed piney woods that have no resale value. I'm just jumping in with no education in agriculture, where I'm just going to learn in the real world doing it, of figuring out how all this works. I'm going to make all sorts of mistakes. You're never going to make any money. Why would you want to invest in this? And he came back and kind of wrote me a little letter about his whys. And this was pre-COVID. So like, he foresaw a lot of stuff. His concerns were, he was in the big investment banking kind of world. And so he had a lot of insights into supply chain stuff. So part of those insights are like the food industry in America, say like cattle feed. It's highly dependent upon like amino acids and things, which are all manufactured in China. And so he was worried about the political footing with China and where that was going to go. And you see that now with stuff coming out from the government where they're concerned with war with China in the next 5 years. And a lot of those conversations of like supply chain instability, which we saw happening during COVID. He was also concerned about bank bail-ins and getting debanked, which we saw during COVID with conservatives or people who didn't want to take the vaccines. So he wanted his assets as much as he could get out of the mainstream investment marketplaces and into direct relationships, owning hard assets that weren't tied to supply chains. So in this case, he wanted to own cattle. He wanted to own cattle with trusted relationships and cattle that weren't dependent upon feed or medical inputs, which a lot of the medical inputs also come out of China. And then his other motivation was he wanted food security. Not food security in the sense of, say, like calorie, but in quality. So they were, even before COVID, his family was anti-vax and kind of concerned about some of the health issues and risks with that. And so we see more and more in the conversation of agriculture, even now, with like the worry of mRNA vaccines sneaking into the supply chains and not necessarily getting disclosed to consumers. And so he kind of just foresaw this coming. And he's like, that's what I want. I don't want to farm. I don't want to actually even found a farming company. I don't want to be on the board, never talk about farming. I want to build a friendship with somebody who's competent and honest. I want to own the hard assets and have some share in the real yield for food security. I was like, this might work. So we sat down and put our heads together. And what we came up with was this herd share program. He bought the genetics of the cattle. We put them underneath of my stewardship and management, to where we just front loaded it, where I have all decision-making power. I get to manage everything. He doesn't have any say. He can vote with his feet and withdraw his animals if he wanted, but there's like time locks of constraints of how fast he can do that too. And then, so the way it works is that every year when we wean the calves, we split them. The majority of the calves go to the farm to fund it, and he gets some real yield. So now he's got an inflation-hedged hard asset that's decorrelated from the market and the risks of the things he's concerned about with supply chain and food security. Okay, so we built the ranch that way in the first of the leased land over in Virginia, and it was going really well. I got my first cows in 2020, and then COVID happened. And the whole world gets really super concerned about food security, about health stuff, about financial security, and just everybody's mind as far as how they're viewing risk and existential threat just turned on a dime, and like the light bulb came on everywhere.
Hey there. Did you attend our EcoAg conference this year in Madison, Wisconsin? Well, if you didn't, or if you did, we've got the recordings now available. Get on-demand access to every session with the EcoAg recordings. Learn directly from the pioneers of soil health, livestock integration, and profitable regenerative systems, all at your own pace. Speakers include Gabe Brown, Alan Williams, John Kemp, Joel Salatin, and a lot more. We also have additional products that include the full-day workshops done by Matt Powers, John Kemp, Nigel Palmer, Jordan Green, Mark Shepard, and Austin Unruh. These workshops are in depth and will help you dig deep on the presenters' topics. Grab your recordings now at conference.eco-ag.com/24 recordings or find the link in the notes. Because the best investment you can make is in your own knowledge. Now back to the show. Great time to buy some cattle too.
Oh man, I knew it when I got that opportunity to lease the land. I knew there was something happening bigger than I can understand, and I just had to say yes. Because when I signed that lease, I had no money for cows. I was just like, I'm doing this out of obedience, and like the steps of a righteous man are directed by the Lord, right? Like the answers will show up. Like one of my sages, my mentors, he always says miracles take a lot of hard work because you have to hold open the space until they get there. And that's been one of the kind of themes of the story getting here with our operation. So my phone blew up with all sorts of people calling me. Started with his friends, but then grew from there of like, hey, those herd share things, can I have some of those? I was like, well, no, but yes, we'll figure it out. So we did what a lot of people talked about during COVID of got a couple friends together, bought some land. One of my friends is a high net worth guy here in Oklahoma. He pulled the USDA loan for the property to kind of help make it feasible. Raised enough money for kind of the initial down payment and a good chunk of kind of knocking down the land costs in addition to the USDA loan. And we jumped. And we bought this land where I didn't own any cattle. We had some financial runway in the tribe of money we'd raised to do this. But my real gamble was just I knew I had appetite for herd shares. And so then I just hit the street talking about it, hitting the podcast circuit. And we ended up raising in 3 years about $1.5 million in herd shares. And so that's where we were able to scale up this operation from I brought 13 cows from Virginia up to we're at, I don't know, 450 head now, counting calves, maybe 330 or 40, 50 animal units. I've not run the math. Wow, I've sold a bunch. I don't quite remember where we're at. And what that did is it covered a huge chunk of the initial capital costs to get us spun up and started. And so the way I kind of explain it is that farming was always the keystone industry of local economies. And the atomization of the producer and the consumer to where we no longer share time horizons or like positive and negative externalities of health or environmental outcomes, like that's part of why the incentives of farming have broken. And so with the herd share program, it's reinstilling a sense of almost localism, even though not a lot of them actually live in this direct part of the country, where they're now ecological participants sharing the capital cost and the time horizons needed to accomplish this vision we share together. Like we explain it where it's almost like inverse feudalism, where like in a feudal system, the lord owns all the assets and distributes them out for management by the peasants. In this model, the middle class or lower upper class families that own the breeding stock through herd shares with us, they're bringing their assets under centralized stewardship and conglomerating them for the sake of economically viable scale and system viable scale. And so through doing that, it's kind of like the Greg Judy model 2.0. Do you want to own the assets or control the assets? But we're doing it where there's a long-term vision and there's expectations that are aligned to both in the landholding company, the herd share ownership structures, to where we all share long time horizons, long commitments, and a purpose we're trying to accomplish. And it's all explained really well up front. I mean, like the risk of how we're approaching it, the breeding protocols and how we do it. Like the herd share package that we share with people is about 8 pages long of like just this basic introduction to animal genetics, regenerative agriculture, and how it works, and really gets into the details because I want educated people participating with me where they are actually vested in the long-term goals and capable of weathering the volatility with us because they believe in like what we're invested in creating through that hardship we're sharing together. So it's like we're all getting onto a ship and we're sailing through storms, which is why it's important that there's actually a true trustee with real management capability, right? Like I don't flinch with the coal rates. I explain the coal rates before people bought into the system early. And that's all getting more and more stabilized now that we're in like year 4 and then going into year 5.
Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit more. So let's, in small terms, someone decides to have a herd share with you. They buy one animal. That animal you buy, they pay what what are they paying for? Are they paying for what you buy the animal for plus a finder fee of some sort? Like, where do you end up covering your costs at? And then once that animal's bought, you breed them, and then say they have, one calf comes back to your operation, one calf then continues on their balance sheet. And are those animals then on that herd share owner's balance sheet, or is it on your farm balance sheet?
Great question. Okay, so let me start with the two different buckets of herd share owners we have. We basically have two different, I don't want to say classes, but basically two different size groups of participants. Some people own like 1 to 3 cows. They're mostly younger people who believe in what we're doing. They want to have a little bit of food security. They also, because they're insiders of members in the herd share project, they also get first claim to what's produced here before the public, which is a value in itself. And then the other group are families that own somewhere between like 15 to even like 50 or 60 herd shares. The way the distributions work is it's all just done where the accounting is in animals, not in dollars, which is an important mental shift. It's a part of the hard asset model. And so it's all just pegged to what happens in the real world. So say there's 100 cows, say we have like 85% breeding efficiency of weaned calves. And say somebody, for easy numbers, say they own 10. Okay, so they would have claim to 10% of those 85 calves, which is 8.5 calves, multiplied by their contractual like distribution percentages. And so currently most of the contracts we're doing, they get 2% of the breeding stock animals and 8% of the meat stock animals. So they would get 8.5 calves. Those are broken down into classes. The breeding stock class, they get 2%, say, which just for ease of numbers right now, which say half of them are breeding stock. So they get 2% of 4.25 animals, and they get 8% of 4.25 animals. Okay. And so that goes into basically their balance sheet on the ranch. The animals stay under management. The way that the program works is they can vote with their feet by withdrawing assets. So the contractual obligation is that if they want to withdraw, everything works in 6-month reporting periods. They request a withdrawal in 6 months. It's the farm's job to satisfy that withdrawal at their convenience in the next 6 months. So just pending whenever we're running animals or through shoots or anything. And it's our job to just get those animals to the sorting pen. For breeding stock, there's actually some time locks where, like, when they first buy in, they can't do anything for 2 years. That's due to the fact that it takes a year to gestate and a year to raise and wean. I'm not paid for managing that animal for 2 years until I get my split, right? And then every 6 months, they can withdraw 25% of their breeding stock. That's basically to set clear expectations for everybody getting on the ship so that none of the big holders can disrupt the genetic score of the herd by trying to withdraw too quickly. It's like enforced long time horizons of sharing a long-term vision together, right? The meat stock, they can withdraw all of it as quick as they want.
When they withdraw, are you just buying that animal then, and it goes back into your?
So it's all just done in physical animals to where that my job's to get the animal to the sorting pen. That's the explicit commitment. Implicitly, what I tell the herd share owners is like, look, I'm going to the sale barn or I'm going to the butcher shop all the time with the farm split of the animals. So the split that goes to the farm is just full owned by the farm. It stays in the herd share like system, but it's just like 100% distribution of the farm's animals go to the farm. And so what I can do is they throw me a little bit of tip for transport. I'll throw it on the trailer and I'll take that animal to the butcher or to the sale barn. I'll tell the sale barn, like, hey, half of this animal or 3 of these animals is owned by so-and-so. When it sells, ship them their check or take it to the butcher. Like, half this animal or 3 of these animals are owned by so-and-so. They'll call you and tell you what cuts they want, and then they'll pay you for processing it. And so it's all done in animals. It's not done in meat. It's not done in dollars. So it's not like the farm is a bank to where, say, we're like buying out these assets when somebody wants liquidated in and out. They're actually like almost like they're participants in a farm. Like we call it like building your manor, right? Like they're delegating stewardship over a farm of animals they own, and then it's their job to do what they want with those animals. I mean, they could pick it up in a trailer and take it to their own backyard and just throw an animal in their backyard and let it finish that way too. We even have some herd share owners that are guys that have careers where it doesn't quite make sense for them to farm, but they do want to farm one day. And so rather than invest in land while they have money and working in their careers, they're investing in animals. And so they're allowing us to grow a genetics breeding stock herd for them, as well as develop the genetics over handfuls of generations. And these are guys that in like 15, 20, 30 years, their intention is to withdraw the genetics and go start their own grass ranch, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. So they, how do you set up the initial payment?
Yeah. So initial payment currently, we're doing $4,000 per herd share. They're hard to price because nobody's done this before. So like the spread of cattle value is just massive in the market right now. I mean, you could see like just, I don't know, old guys selling just woods cows that are not papered. I mean, I still see homesteaders selling like mama cows for $800 or $900, which is wild. Or you've got like the Faro like genetics grass sale or the South Pole sales. I think the Faro bull sale, I think they averaged like, I think it was either 10 grand or 14 grand per bull. In the South Pole sale, the females were somewhere between like $5 or $6 or $7,000 a female. And then like you also got the numbers of say like USDA grass-fed average prices. Right now, USDA grass-fed average is like $8.60 a pound hot hanging weight. So if you had 1,000-pound animal that butchered at 60%, 600 pounds times that ends up being a little over $4,000. It's like $4,250 or something. So even at USDA grass prices, it's right in that right kind of range. What we're doing right now is I'm going out and buying heritage breed females who are largely underpriced because the market doesn't like these horned spotted cows. But the long-term vision is this grass genetics resilience and adaptability and disease resistance, right? And so I'm explaining all this to herd owners when they buy in. It's like, hey, my current market price for Piney Woods, I'm going to go down to the main conservation farm in Mississippi. He's got 80 cows available this year. He's going to sell them to me for $1,850 a head or something like that. And so that's what I'm starting with. They're 1 year old at the time. We're going to run the program, develop the genetics. And what I do is with that buy-in money, part of that money is just there for operational expenses for getting production spun up. And so part of what's being believed in and invested in by the herd owners is understanding that we're taking animals that are underpriced, developing genetics that are more resilient than anything in the market, and they're investing in, believing in the fact that we're going to develop genetics that are comparable or better to what's available out there as far as like these high value like sales of like South Pole or Mashona or Faro composites, right? But it's all got that floor price of the meat value, which still makes it a good deal for them because at any point they wanted, they could withdraw an animal, process it as a grass-based animal, and the USDA average price is about right where what we're charging per herd share.
Yeah, I mean that's about where we're at for finished beef. I mean we're moving up a little bit this year, but so you essentially get the money up front is what you would get if you were just to take that animal and finish them, and then they have a winning opportunity. You know, if that turns into a breeding stock animal, then they have the ability to make that money over 5-10 years, and they're going to make a lot more than just that back.
Yeah, it's designed to have small yield. I mean, we all know farming is not super viable. And so the incentives here are not they're not financial. It's not like if you want to make the most money, like go buy Bitcoin, right? Don't buy cattle. But what they want is food security and they want some diversification. And so it's a hard asset with real yield if you can argue about what inflation rates are. And so even if you look at the numbers and crunch them with those distribution rates, I mean, you're probably looking at once we stabilize, because this first couple of years of getting the genetics dialed in and the systems going, like we're washing out animals and like we're definitely not at the breeding rates we will be over the next 2, 3, 4 years as we really get spun up and going. But once we're dialed in, say if we're getting 85% breed back and weaned animals, you're only still looking at maybe 1.5% real yield. But I mean, you've got that versus say like go buy treasuries that your return on treasuries don't even outpace inflation. cattle definitely outpace inflation because they're hard assets, and the yield is measured in a real way, is measured in the asset itself. So it's not a ton of yield, but it's a real yield that's going to be like larger than inflation because it's a real asset, and it's food security plus diversification.
When that animal has a calf,
Mm-hmm.
that calf becomes the herd. The first calf becomes the herd share. Herd shares on their balance sheet.
It's the split. So it's not tied to any particular animal. There's kind of like a abstraction layer to where they get that, like we were saying, like 100 cows, 85 calves, they own 10 herd shares. So it's 8.5 calves times their distribution percentage, which is 2% for breeding stock, 8% for meat stock. So they get that percentage added to their balance sheet. And then when they go to withdraw, the farm gets to choose which particular animals are given to them at the withdrawal.
Gotcha.
Yep.
So I mean, they're because if you know what would maybe you haven't had this conversation. This is part of the education coming up on the beginning of this. But like if they had bought a $4,000 animal and then wanted it back before it bred, or just and they thought they were going to take it to a sales barn, like they probably wouldn't be very happy with what they get out of that.
Agreed, which I explained that all to them when we're actually starting the process and onboarding them. But there's always the exit of just taking it to meat, which is they're going to make some money there because the meat value is higher. I mean, even if you look at the market for grass-fed beef, your average direct-to-consumer grass-fed company, like Perennial Pastures or Rep Provision or White Oak Farms, these kind of big companies, whether it's grass or grain, the direct-to-consumer market's very similar. The grass-fed premium of direct-to-consumer is less than 5%. You're looking at typically about $9,000 per carcass. So most of those ranches, they're spending about $1,500 per carcass on marketing. And then the rest of that is just being sold as basically like $250 beef boxes. So you've got a lot of customers per carcass. Like you're looking at like 20 to 40 customers per carcass. So if they're looking at that as the quality of food they want, buying in with long time horizons here, they're actually able to have animals when they want to exit that they're just paying for processing, and then they're ending up with value there where they're not having to pay that premium they'd be paying at a direct consumer, like whatever type price points. So if you run the numbers, this will give you a little more context. The ownership plays out with, say, like reasonably forecasted breeding percentages and death losses and all that, that if you own 15 herd shares, you get about half a calf a year in meat distributions. So that kind of shows you the ratio. So if they put in $60,000 of owning cattle with us, with our expected outcomes once we reach steady state, which we should be there probably within the next year or two, they'll get half a calf a year. So part of these families that are buying in larger, they just never want to have to think about food security or buying beef again. So they're buying like 15, 30, 45 herd shares for the sake of getting like half a calf, whole calf, cow and a half per year. Now, granted, the distributions are all tracked by age buckets. So that calf is a year and a half, or is a year old when it's distributed. And depending on finishing speed, 2 years, 3 years old, it takes a couple of years to fill up the pipeline. But then once they've waited long enough, so it's like the 2 years to have a 1 year old, and just call it a generous 2 years for having 3 year olds, then every year after that, they've got another one in the pipe behind it. So say 5 years in, they've got beef for life they never have to pay for again, minus paying for processing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, well, do you ever see, I mean, I think one of our advantages in these systems with these grass share or grass fed genetics is, and you see some people, you mentioned farrow, I would like to think that there is going to be a major premium on these genetics. You know, if for whatever reason you get a larger group of people to move over into grass fed cattle, I mean, these genetics are going to be worth a lot more than, or maybe we'll get to the same level that, you know, the high genetics are in the normal market are right now.
I definitely think so, especially in the ultra high density grazing paradigm, because it's so early. I mean, there's 2 ranches in the country I would actually buy cattle from, and neither one of them are selling genetics because they're just trying to build their own herd. Because the percentage of animals that succeed in the systems are so low that it's taken a long time for them to build up their or their actual like herd numbers. And the systems are so good for building fertility that a lot of these guys have been doing this for a handful of years, and their carry capacity to the land is growing faster than they can grow their herd. So like the number of
they just
guys
keep adding.
selling ultra high density type genetics into the US that are hardier than like farrow cattle is just, I mean, you could maybe buy 5 to 10 of these type animals per year in the marketplace of the guys I know that are pushing the edge on this stuff. So as that's growing in popularity, which Jaime Elizondo is really driving a lot of, we're getting more and more people calling us of like, hey, do you got any females for sale? I'm like, no, call me in 10 years. But because of that, the premium on them are going to be so high. And that's one thing we're doing well with the ranch. I mean, in 3 years, we've become recognized nationally as one of the leaders in ultra high density with the programs we're doing. And like we've had classes hosted with the Noble Institute, and we're working with the Oklahoma Conservation Commission, and really have built a lot of reputation around it. Like we also help run a Facebook group that teaches ultra high density grazing with a couple other ranches like Robbins Ranch in Arkansas or Reverend Wild in Georgia or Running Tea Farms over in Carolina. And so there definitely is that growing interest in these types of cattle. The hard part is like the lack of liquidity in the sale barn market, because the whole market is just driven by black-hided, huge-framed Angus. And that goes to the conversation of grass-finished beef quality. You probably know this already. If you look at nutrient density testing, the spread of data on grass-fed cows is huge. The worst grass-fed cows are less nutrient dense than even like a good chunk of the grain-fed cows. And some of them are really good. But consumer experience of the quality of grass-fed meat is really poor. Like these big operations, some of which you know their names, so I'm not going to throw them under the bus. But these guys who are selling their carcasses for $9,000 a carcass and spending $1,500 a carcass marketing them, and they're guys that are writing books and doing interviews and in documentaries. These operations, most of them have negligible, like single-digit % repeat customers. And it's not a price problem. They can get as many first-time customers as they want through the marketing. It's a meat quality problem. There's a couple layers behind that. One is the fact that they're selling unfinished animals.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you think it's are they stealing some from other places and then just running them on grass for a month and calling it good? Plus they're finishing them early.
Some of them are, even of these well-reputed, well-known operations. Like one of them I know of, where my buddies are over ranching by them. They're doing about 20% of the beef they sell is actually raised on their own farm. Like most people devolve into wholesalers. Economic problems push people there. The only companies making any money in the U.S. right now are banks or companies who become a quasi bank. Like, is Apple selling phones, or are they making money with Apple Pay? They became a bank and a credit card company. Like grocery stores. You know that grocery stores actually make, most grocery stores, more money on their payment terms than they actually make on their margins of selling groceries. So like the way that works, you go in and buy groceries at a grocery store, you pay them instantly when you buy the groceries. They're not paying their suppliers, but usually for net 90, sometimes net 180. And so what they do is they take your money and they invest it, and they make money on their investments before they pay their suppliers. Most grocery stores are making more money as, quote, investment banks than they are as grocery stores. The other people in the U.S. who make money are basically like digitizing an industry to its own destruction. So that would be like Uber destroying the taxi industry, but Uber's never actually made money. They just became really valuable in an equity position. Or Twitter would be another example. They destroyed mass media, but like Twitter's never really been profitable either. Or like entertainment.
I call these data companies. I think there's same with Apple.
Yep.
I
Yep.
mean, the credit card processing is definitely one of them, but they're selling and leveraging data.
Yeah, and that's where like marketing comes in, because marketing, you're almost selling feel good entertainment. And so most of these companies end up devolving into marketing entities rather than actually farms, which is a problem. But it's just they end up going where the economic incentives take them. But so they're selling unfinished beef. The reason they're doing that is because they can't carry the beef long enough to actually fatten it and finish it, because then they don't make money because they have the animal for too long. Um, like explaining that for listeners, the speed at which you finish an animal is huge for driving the cost that's in that animal. Because every day you feed an animal, that animal has a maintenance energy requirement, and only the surplus energy is being added to the carcass. So you have this daily cost that's going into simply keeping the animal, where a small percentage of it is actually going into growing the animal. And so you have this exponential math that happens where the faster you finish them, the less your cost is. And so they're trying to finish them and get them on the market faster so they have a better profit margin, but they're not getting repeat customers because the meat's just not any good. And so there's layers to this. There's like, well, how do we finish them faster but actually get them fat? Well, the genetics question, right? Like environmental adaptations, there's less energy being spent on stress, like early sexually maturing animals, smaller frame sizes, lower maintenance energy requirements. This is where like Johann's principles of breeding really come through. There's also developing soil fertility and biological diversity, both of soil biology and of plant diversity. The more you develop that, the higher the Brix level is in the pasture, so the faster they gain weight. You've also got like processing. Most grass-based genetics are smaller framed, and they have less of a fat cap. This more intramuscular marbling rather than like the fat cap of like these big black-hide and Angus. And you've got problems there that hurt meat quality. So you have this phenomena that happens when they're processing an animal. What they do, they kill the animal, skin it, gut it, hang it. Usually in the mainstream industry of processing, they're just pumping animals through. They'll take those animals after they're put on the rail and just immediately push them into a 35-degree chiller. Okay. For mainstream large-hided or large frame Angus that have a good fat cap, that's not really that big of a problem because they have so much thermal mass. There's a sweet spot of temperature and pH that makes quality meat. And it's the sweet spot is when the carcass enters into full rigor mortis. So it's like that 18, 16 hour time window, right? And that sweet spot is about 52 degrees. And so for a large carcass that's well insulated with fat cap of like mainstream Angus genetics, you push it immediately in a 35-degree chiller. It doesn't chill so fast it causes any issues. It still kind of gets close to that sweet spot. For a grass genetics animal, it's a little smaller frame that doesn't have that exterior wasted fat cap. They chill really quickly. And so the majority of these carcasses are doing what's called cold shortening because they're going into rigor at too cold of a temperature. And what that does, it causes the protein molecules to cross-link, and it gets really tough. And this is where that reputation for grass-fed meat not having good mouthfeel or tenderness comes from. Okay, so fertility of pasture, so high Brix level for like high energy in the feeds, genetics that have a higher surplus energy because of lower maintenance energy and better adapted and quicker finishing, dialing in butchering practices. You put those three together, you're actually able to finish grass genetics animals at a higher quality point that customers actually enjoy. There's nobody in the industry doing this. A lot of my conversations with Kenneth working with that fermented feed program, his idea here is that there's not very many people who have the skill to go out and do so like a Wayne Ingham style advanced compost teas for fixing the soil biology, or ultra high density grazing and developing genetics to push succession of species and biological diversity of the forages forward. And we need scale to be able to provide quality meat to the marketplace. And you see all this grass-fed meat marketed. Like there's a company I'm seeing all over my Facebook feed advertising right now, like grass-fed Wagyu. And if you look at the data, what they're actually doing, they're finishing these Wagyu on sprouted fodder. And if you test the fatty acid profile with omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, they do not have the omega ratio of grass-fed beef. It's not actually, quote, true grass-fed beef. Nor does it have a high like fat soluble vitamin, phytonutrient content, or even trace mineral? Because that sprouted fodder is basically just water. When you sprout fodder, you're putting it in a pan, you're soaking it so the grains grow. They put up some leaf. They have like this root mat of young grass, and they feed it to the animal. It's pretty high in energy, which is why people do it, and it allows you to marble up the carcass. But that fodder never has any time to develop. The roots aren't in soil, so it's not having that soil biology manufacture like the more complex amino acids or like fatty acids that you would see of like that real nutrient, like rich forages or forb heavy pasture you'd have like in a real diverse ecology. And it has the exact same fatty acid profile as the grain. It doesn't actually change in that short period of time with those young grasses. So they have carcasses that are being claimed to be grass fed. It's got the pro-inflammation omega-6 ratio is really high, like usually like 6 to 8 to 1 rather than 1 to 1 or 2 to 1. And add to that, sprouted finishing systems, due to the moisture and just the nature of doing sprouted fodder, they end up really high in myco and aflatoxins because it's just such a mold-rich environment. And so if you take these guys who are selling this really high-end grass-finished, quote-unquote, grass-finished Wagyu, and you test the beef, it's not pro-health because it's got a poor pro-inflammation omega profile. It lacks nutrient density of trace minerals, fat-soluble vitamins, and phytonutrients. And it'll test high for residual myco and aflatoxins because the feed was so high in it. So what Kenneth is working on is developing fermented fodder finishes to where he's got a particular inoculant he spent about 20 years developing. And that inoculant is breaking down the lignins and turning them into the types of fatty acids that humans flourish on. And he's basically pre-digesting those forages to make them more soluble so that the cow has a lot more efficiency per pound of food they eat. So his idea there is that we can take farms that aren't optimized, that don't have perfect genetics, don't have perfect soil and grazing systems, and be able to take that rumen, which is breaking down feed over like a 30-hour period, and put in more soluble feeds to where the surplus energy the animal's absorbing is a lot higher because it's pre-digested, right? And his inoculants are incredible. I mean, he's even showing tests that's breaking down glyphosate or herbicides or myco and aflatoxins that are just coming out super clean. So it's a huge tool in the toolbox for one, getting mainstream adoption that's actually coming out with an output that tests for true nutrient density and doing that with operations that aren't perfected, which is great because we need that to be able to get there with scaled production. The other is it'll help guys trying to do what I'm doing, where while I'm adapting genetics, I can keep grazing really hard, but I could say roll out a bale a day of this fermented feed of these round bales I ferment and give the cows enough of advantage. I can keep the pressure on the land, but not have quite as much stress on the cows, which gives me a larger margin of error, which is great for people trying to like AI in genetics or bring in bulls to adapt their herd over to these more intensive grazing systems, because it keeps them from having body conditions slip to the point where they're making mistakes that hurt breed back and then hurt profitability, right? So I love what he's doing. You put all this together, then you're able to finish beef faster. And this is biological diversity, proper genetics, tooling like Kenneth with the fermented feed, and then processing the carcasses properly. You put all this together, you're able to come out with meat that's just incredible. And so Kenneth has been telling me, because he's developed the science and published in his research, he has high-end meat buyers reaching out to him of like, these are guys who provide like really high-end, like Wagyu for like super fancy restaurants or rich people with their private chefs. And what these buyers want is they want omega balanced meat with high trace mineral and fat soluble vitamin, like super nutrient density, that like true grass fed, that is well marbled and tender. And basically they can't find that product to buy. Nobody's producing it. Everybody's claiming to produce it, but nobody is. And Kenneth has become a bit of a black sheep because he's showing so much data that people are upset with him because everybody's out marketing they're doing a certain thing, but their data doesn't actually support what they're claiming they're producing. And there's a market opportunity for the guys who put these pieces together first to get in there with these meat buyers who are these cutting edge buyers trying to push really quality. Like I would call it, like, to kind of call from Andrew Murray, that therapeutic grade food. That's what they want. And the price they're paying for carcasses are huge. I mean, Kenneth has told me that, like, just getting kind of the entry level of this, they're looking at like 4 to 5 pounds hanging weight wholesale. But for really quality nutrient tested meat, these buyers aren't flinching at talking about $15 to $20 a pound hanging weight. Yeah. And so that opens up an entire new market, because for an operation like us, most of us, we'd have to build a whole separate, essentially like sub company or profit center that's direct to consumer, dealing with the logistics of all these customers and like $250 beef boxes. So I need 20 to 40 people per cow. I mean, if I'm trying to move 3, 4, 500, 600, 500 cows a year, that's a lot of people. Like, I need a whole team doing that. But
it's a whole business.
With these guys trying to develop a wholesale market for this high quality beef, it lets me focus on farming. And so we're trying to push that forward and forerun showing what's actually possible on nutrient outcomes. And then long term, what I want to do is kind of move towards where the industry is trying to go. Like, you've got a lot of these certification entities for like regenerative meat, and most of them are making mistakes to where it's either such a high cost that it's not useful for farms, or they're like trying to fake it till they make it. They're promising suppliers or purchasers that meat's going to be there, and promising suppliers that customers will be there, but it's not really there. And so both are getting let down. So it's kind of breaking faith in the industry. Or a lot of these certification companies that are emerging, they are trying to apply the worldviews and presuppositions of the mainstream meat market to regenerative farming. Like the way I've explained this, like I had one of those companies. They had a lot of certified cow-calf producers, but no finishing operations. So they wanted to send me cattle to finish. I was like, okay, like, cool, let's talk about it, before I had the cow numbers I had now. And so they wanted to pay me per pound of gain, and they wanted to ship me cattle from cow-calf operations. Like, okay, where are these cows coming from? Or they're like, well, like out in the Midwest. I'm like, okay, where in the Midwest? What genetics are these animals? And what it turned out, they were wanting to bring me cows from really mineral-rich, low humidity type operations out, say, like Colorado, where that forage is incredible. It's like high desert plains type grazing, low parasite pressure, and they wanted me to bring them into Oklahoma on humid fescue and finish them in 90 days. And I'm like, guys, this is not how this works. Like, cows are only fungible because in the mainstream commodity marketplace for commodity cattle and beef, because of feed inputs and medical inputs. If we're doing regenerative systems without high energy grains or anti-parasite and medical inputs, I bring a high desert Colorado cow to my ranch in Oklahoma, forget finishing it. That cow's going to lose weight the first 90 days. Like this, I can't do that. You're going to leave me as the bag holder. And so finishing operations and regenerative supply chains need to bring a different worldview to the process of how we build the logistics of approaching it. And it has to be ecologically grounded, which nobody's thinking about. So where I think the industry is actually going to end up going is really what's happening just organically or naturally through the research like Kenneth is doing with the ranches he's working with, where he's publishing nutrient data outcomes. And I want to get into working with, I have a lot of conversation with Graham Hand, who's like an ecological researcher and scientist, about easy ways to measure environmental outcomes. And they're doing stuff like even using satellites, where like you just fly over the property and you can get really interesting data just from like a distant snapshot. Stacking that with some basic soil testing. And so I want to, as a ranch, publish two things at once. I want to publish nutrient density outcomes and ecological outcomes to help set standards of like, look, it's possible to do both of these, and it's possible for it to look like this at this level, and educate consumers to start asking about seeing that data, and let it be a natural drive from the consumer to push past the greenwashing and the misinformation to where it's holding the industry accountable to get away from this like fodder finished Wagyu that's not actually grass fed and is not therapeutic type meat. So like that's the state of the grass finished industry. And when you stack this with, like we were talking about, the economic advantages of regenerative systems, where you get 4, 5, 6 years in, you're carrying 3 to 4 times the number of cattle, that will drive a buyer marketplace that exists that's not black-hided Angus, that what they care about is the quality of meat, not the fashion and fad of the mainstream commodity market. And that will make regenerative ranching and farming much more viable in America. And the guys who forerun that are going to have a huge edge.
Well, I think technology is going to give us the nutrient testing is going to become a lot easier. I think at some point in the future, we're going to have an app on our phone. You can snapshot a photo of something, or they'll make little, devices that at the butcher, that's what they're testing. They're not necessarily testing, if they grade out a certain way, they're testing that nutrient quality, and then that would give the wholesalers what they want as well.
That'll be huge. I've talked to some guys who are working on developing those technologies. And if we can get to where any consumer at any farmer's market could just use some sort of cheap app or cheap thing that has like a Bluetooth link to their phone to test like fatty acid ratios, fat soluble vitamins, trace minerals, and phytonutrients, that will be huge because it's going to create accountability and drive us towards better food production practices. Like that is something that really needs to be developed.
I mean, even if it comes out as a tool of some sort and farmers have them for their marketing use, I mean, or butcher shop is able to buy one or something.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, that's where I'm excited about, because they already have it. Dan, we talk about it a lot. Dan Kittredge at Bionutrient Association's made one, it tests vegetables, but they don't think they're that far away from being able to test meat.
That's awesome. Bionutrient Association?
Yeah, Dan Kittredge.
I need to look into the work they're doing. But yeah, so to kind of sum this up to action steps, what do we need to do as ranchers in America? Well, we need to support the politicians and the push trying to fix Triffin's dilemma. So I'm pro tariffs and the things Trump's doing there of trying to reshore American production.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit, explain that a little bit more. What what are the positives of it? I think a lot of people in the ag world are probably not thrilled about it. I think in the grass-fed world, it seems like it would be hard for it to hurt anything.
Yeah, because you're less input dependent theoretically. And so it's going to actually put pressure against the dollar mismatch of making imported lean beef be what's so dominant in the industry.
It would hurt, or at least get our price, be more price competitive with the imports coming that are grass-fed.
Correct. And the point that most people need to understand that few people do is that this is not trying to subsidize Americans lacking efficiency. Like this isn't like trying to break down free trade and make American ranchers have an advantage that's outpriced us in the marketplace. What this is trying to do is overcome the macroeconomic issue of Triffin's dilemma and being the world reserve currency. There's a bigger thing at play here that we're all subject to this slow, collapse of domestic production due to the dollar strength.
Do you think it, because I've seen a lot of folks who I had a lot of respect for, especially when it comes to economics, hate tariffs, but it's because it's a short-term issue for sure. Like it's a short-term slower of the economy, but you feel, if you look at it even like a 4 or 5 year standpoint, it's going to be positive.
Yeah, America's greatest periods in history of production and economic power actually correlated to where America was more isolationist. Most of economics taught today in the college world, which I know because I was a part of it, are very Keynesian in the way they approach things. And the science of economics is not really well matched to how reality functions if you understand history. And it just goes back to the education system of the science is often asking the wrong questions and thus arriving at stupid answers. And we see this in the grass and just cattle world all the time too. I could dive into so many silly areas of that. Easy, stupid example of bad science, fun little rabbit trail. Feed efficiency testing on cattle. That is a test that is largely leading to cattle that are the least feed efficient. Do you know why? Okay, so what's happening is they take an animal, they put it in a pen, they feed it a calorie-controlled ration. They measure its pound of gain of weight per calorie put in. Okay, look at this from a like standpoint of nutrition and like sports fitness is where my background came from that made this make sense to me. I know from weightlifting and things that a gram of fat is 9 calories, a gram of protein is 4 calories. So if you look at calories in versus pounds out, you're inherently selecting animals that put on lean mass, not animals that fatten. What that means is you're inherently selecting leggy, tall carcasses that are lean versus carcasses that fatten. So if you want an animal that's feed efficient and early sexually maturing and fertile and well marbled, you want an animal that puts on fat quickly, not an animal that puts on lots of lean mass and body frame. So by selecting for their measurement of feed efficiency, they're actually selecting for the least feed efficient animals. Now, there would be a way to do good science. I mean, you could go and do like a DEXA scan, or like, I don't know if you can get a cow to sit still enough, but like bodybuilders do like a float tank where they submerge themselves and then look at like how much water flows out of the tank. And they use that to compute how much of their body percentage is fat versus lean mass of protein. And then you can run a calculation of energy accumulation. So calories in, how much energy is in the carcass and body. That would include running that ratio of fat to protein. And that would show feed efficiency, not purely pound of gain. Now, you don't really need that. If you select for fertility, fertility is the catch-all that actually shows all that with early sexual maturity. But like, this just goes to show how bad science creates bad practices. Like, another example would be the Kreider study, where they were doing testing on root pruning. And this has shaped so much of the regenerative world, where they had plants, they would come through and clip them. They'd clip some where they left 90% of the leaf, some where they clip on the leaf 50% of the leaf, and some where they clip and leave 10% of the leaf. They would come through with scissors, and they were doing it kind of sporadically on like a handful of days or a weekly basis. And what they showed was root sloughing and root stunting of slowing down the more aggressively you clipped it. So the whole industry interpreted this as intensive grazing leads to root death. It doesn't. What leads to root death is overgrazing defined by time, not intensity. If you clip grass that's not fully recovered over and over again on a handful of days or weekly basis, you're taking that first green shoot and just second biting it over and over, and you're killing the plant. Of course the roots slough off or the roots slow down and die. Versus if you look at the work being done by like Elaine Ingham, or like Jaime's showing this on a lot of the ranches he consults with total grazing, if you graze intensively and graze it down to like even just an inch or two of residue, Elaine's gone and dug that stuff up, and they're showing no root slowdown. And so the way Jaime explains it is really simple. Don't graze under recovered grasses. Intensity is not correlated to that. It's time. Overgrazing is a function of time, not intensity. So bad science leading to bad conclusions, leading to entrenched bad practices in an industry, right?
Hey, eco farmers. This is Taylor Henry with Acres U.S.A. I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I enjoy interviewing these folks. If you're serious about regenerative agriculture, I've got an incredible resource you need to check out, the Acres U.S.A. membership. You farm in the physical world, and you deserve a physical printed magazine to match. Since 1971, Acres U.S.A. magazine has been the leading voice in ecological agriculture, delivering the best insights from regenerative farmers, agronomists, and researchers to help you farm profitably without toxic chemicals. Our membership included physical and digital copies of the magazine each month of the year, which has always been a standard for Acres U.S.A., but we wanted to over-deliver on content. When I acquired this business, I was happy to find that we had years of audio files from presentations at our annual EcoAg conference. And guess what? They were hiding. Well, not anymore. We developed this membership portal that gives you access to the recordings from farmers like Gabe Brown, Gary Zimmer, Joel Salatin, and Mark Shepard. We also include recordings of private events. Finally, if you are like me and you like listening to content, we are now producing a membership-only podcast of each issue of the magazine, so you can consume each article while you're out in the field. To make things even sweeter, you'll get discounts on books, workshops, and events to keep expanding your knowledge. So are you ready to take your farming to the next level? Join today for a ridiculously low price at eco-farming.com or see details in the notes. Yeah, there's always a graph that runs around in our circles right now where it shows, you take half of the forage, the roots go down 100%. You take three quarters, they shrink. You take everything but 10%, the roots shrink down. So you're saying you don't think that's correct?
Not at all. And one of these days I need to put together a slideshow when I'm doing an interview like this where I show some of the before and after pictures of our grazes. What we're seeing with the intense grazes is incredibly fast recovery. I mean, I'll see in that first 10, 15 days, 6, 8, 9 inches of growth just banging back because we're resting it for so long and we're grazing it at like the flag stage of the warm season, the boot stage of the cool seasons. And then it's like we break the farm in half every year. The grazing half, we're grazing at kind of that kind of rotation. And then the rest of the farm stockpiles for grazing in the non-growing season. That stockpile allows that full reproductive cycle to happen, which is good for like plant diversity and everything setting its roots down and whatever. And then we come through and every time we're grazing it as high of utilization as we can get it. I mean, there's just like an inch or two of residue. And so it's putting equal pressure on all the grasses. And what you see is like one super fast recovery because you've got all this reserve energy because I'm grazing it slightly more mature than most people would. You see a little bit of sun on the soil surface, which helps break parasite cycles. But that hard graze is causing a root exudate dump through stress on the plants. I think I've never seen science behind this. It's not something that's been well researched, but I think there's some sort of quorum sensing happening between that root exudate dump, sun on the soil surface is causing a seed bank activation in the grass or in the like ground. The hoof impact helps that too because it kind of is like pressing that seed stuff in and stomping it in. So what we see is a massive succession of species and increase in diversity. You see an improved leaf to stem ratio. You see activation of stolen growth on all the clump grasses to where the plant area spacing gets a heck of a lot better. And the quality of the grass due to the improved leaf to stem ratio, but even just like the bricks level and the succession of species moving forward every graze cycle is improved. And the richness of just color and like just sugar, mineral, protein, everything in the grass is a lot higher. We've had some sections in our property that entire fields were just invasive thistle, like Scotch musk, Canadian thistles, where 60-80% of the field, if you measure it by dry matter content, was thistles. And what we did is we did three things. We released some gulf flies and some thistle weevils as just biological controls. The thistle weevils lay their eggs in the flower heads of the thistles, so the larvae eat a lot of the seeds and put some reproductive pressure on the thistles. The gulf flies kind of drill into the stems and drink some of the sap, which puts a little stress on them. And then we did the intensive non-selective grazing, and my cows actually will go through and eat the thistles and just hammer them. So kind of back to kind of John Kemp's philosophy of metabolic states in plants, right? Weeds are pioneer species. They prefer unbalanced soil conditions, kind of terrain theory, manage for what you want versus try to manage for what you don't. Okay, so thistle in particular, it likes calcium imbalances and poorly aggregated compacted soils. Those thistles have deep tap roots and actually pump a lot of root exudates down that actually build a lot of soil aggregates. And so that plant metabolic pyramid that John Kemp has. You've got 4 stages of plant metabolism. The first stage is simple sugars. The second stage is complex carbohydrates. The third stage is complex carbs and complete amino acids. The fourth stage is complex carbs, complete amino acids, and fatty acids being produced. And the soil biology is actually what's functioning as an external digestive system to produce those complete amino acids and those fatty acids for the plant. And what John has shown, which is really cool, is that as you advance up to the higher states of metabolic health, the crop becomes more disease and insect resistant. So like they had those farms over in the Middle East they were consulting with when you saw those giant like locust plagues, and I think it was like during 2021 or something, where everything's just getting decimated by these biblical style just famine events. And the locusts aren't eating crops on the fields that Advancing Eco was consulting on because they had such a high level of complex carbs, amino acids, and fatty acids. There was no simple sugars in the plant. locusts, grasshoppers, they have a very simple digestive tract that can only break down simple sugars. So they'd go and bite the crop. There's no food for them. They'd leave it alone, right? So take that back to weeds. Weeds prefer and balanced soil. Their metabolic health actually goes the opposite direction. As the soil improves, they kind of regress down to a lower metabolic state, and they become more prone to pest and disease pressures. So managing like we're doing with these high density grazes, we get the seed bank activation. Whatever's most suited to grow in the current soil conditions, what grows in. Some of it's weediness, but what happens is over time, as the organic matter in the soil comes up, just through things breaking down in it, the soil's coming more and more into balance, and then the weeds and pioneer species end up getting more and more stressed due to that phenomena, while the higher palatable species are less and less stressed. And so the weeds and pioneer species of the low quality stuff dies back, and we leap forward of the higher quality stuff and the more diversity of the higher quality stuff coming in every time. You do more of a light rotational, like a Greg Judy style, take half, leave half graze. You end up having to do brush controls like Greg Judy does, of hack and squirt, of going out and controlling shrubs and things. And you end up with more and more of a monoculture, to where like the things the cows don't like, say like the toxic fescue, that they avoid clipping it hard because it's got a high endophyte load down by the crown of the plant. That plant has a competitive advantage every grazing cycle. So you're not actually having soil and the conditions of the soil being able to produce what the soil wants to produce taking a hold. You have the plants that have a competitive advantage due to grazing practices become more and more invasive. So the high density grazing is actually driving forward ecological advancement of diversity. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I've kind of found the same thing. We got a Brix refractometer this year, and it seems like all the paddocks that, we've hit the hardest has the best Brix readings. What are your target Brix readings right now? What are you guys seeing?
We're entering into year 4, and we've been working as a core team, probably averaging 80 hours a week, each of our laborers. I've not put much effort into data gathering. Reason being, I want data where data drives decisions, because I have to make decisions on the margin of where I invest effort and resources. And currently, more data wouldn't have changed what I was doing. I'd love to have the data for the sake of showing proof of concepts. And now that we're spun up, the next piece of land I buy, I'm hoping to have more time to actually take more data to show the evolution of the process. But we've not done much this far. Now, I could show me versus the neighbor. I mean, our land was managed exactly the same. The neighbors did everything. They shared. Companies would come in and spray herbicides. They'd share the same company, come in and spread chicken litter. Like everything is exactly the same. And my neighbor didn't change his management, minus destocking, because he sold a bunch of head because he thought the cattle market was super high, which should have helped his land. But if you go out and look at our pastures side by side, I probably have 60%, 70% more dry matter per like square foot of forage than he has. I probably have 3x the diversity he has, and it's probably 100% deeper green colored, which is going to show a higher Brix level. And it's just purely through like the only things we've done were the first couple years, all we do is the high density grazing with the long rest periods with just the system we were just talking about. And then last winter, I spread some of the C90 in the fields, which I thought would help kind of weep it all forward. And that's it. Like he's still fertilizing, he's still putting down chicken litter, and we're overproducing what he is by a lot.
So we're doing some of the C90 amendments. Were you timing that? Like, would you hit paddocks that have been hit in like the last week? Is that when you would spread that?
So last fall we did some foliar sprays, and that's how I did it. But what we did to get a lot down this winter, did it in the winter because the humidity's low. That C90 is a high magnesium salt, so it tends to like pull in moisture and kind of glom up. So we did it while it was cold and dry here in the climate here in Oklahoma, and we actually spread it in a granular level over the winter.
Got it. Yeah, I think we're trying to figure out the best way to do it because, their normal use cases are, spread it after you take a cutting of hay off. And so we've been talking to them saying like, well, how do we show this in, a rotational grazing system? because obviously we're probably not going to have something set up like every day we follow behind them. So
one of the things I want to trial this year is putting in some irrigation. I'm going to do like one of those traveling irrigators that has that winch. So every time it turns the boom, it cranks it. And so it drags a lay flat hose. It's like 150 foot wide, but it can travel about 1,200 feet. I want to put an injector pump and just put an IBC tote that's just getting put in the irrigation and use that to put in biology and a little bit of C90 and do that in the grazing strip behind the cows. So like we graze a strip and then just run the traveling irrigator down it. My thinking was trying to get profitable as a ranch early. I need to carry a good number of animals, but the land's not really caught up to being able to do that yet. We're still slightly understocked. And as long as we get consistent rain, we're still a little understocked. And the land's healing really quick, which is outpacing that, like we were talking about earlier, with the exception of drought. Oklahoma, like the average yearly rainfall in the part of Oklahoma I'm in is like the high 30s or low 40s, but it's so sporadic. I mean, we could easily have consistent rain all summer, or we could be dry for 6 months with hardly a drop. So my thinking was
that's not bad numbers, but didn't you guys get like 12 inches in like 10 hours this spring?
Oh, we got drowned. My ranch in particular was a double whammy where I'm on the Neosho River or Grand River, which has the Hudson Dam or the Hudson Lake and the Kerr Dam underneath of us. And they did some maintenance on the dam over the winter and they had to test it. So they flooded the river up to, I think it was 633 feet. And that water level was so high that my ponds were actually filling with water from the groundwater underneath. Like my neighbor's pasture, he probably had 40% of it was actually underneath the river. I was like actually looking out over the cattle pastures, watching boats basically drive across his land. It was really weird.
Wow.
So they did that test this spring, filled up all the groundwater, and then that week is when that rain hit. We have been drowning this spring. But last summer, I mean, we went from basically June till October with just only a couple inches. It was just dry. So my thinking was, like, I need to carry animals these first couple years. I don't have that much carbon for water holding built up in the soil because I'm only 3 years in. And so I'm going to end up, if I have a drought event, either buying hay or I can put that capital into infrastructure ahead of time and buy water. So long term, I probably won't need it once I get enough carbon built up and I have enough deep root built on all the plants, but that takes a good couple more years to get there.
Are you guys able to graze pretty much through the winter?
We're getting there.
Yeah. What's your average cow eating as far as how many hay bales a year?
So last fall, I scaled up 220 head in the fall, and then we had drought where we didn't get rain until basically the growing season ended. But we also got a grant with Oklahoma. We're part of the Soil Health Implementation Program, which is they're basically working with the leading regenerative farms in Oklahoma to show regenerative practices and how they work. And they wanted to work with a couple farms, have a 3-year program, do soil data testing, and then leverage us for doing education in Oklahoma, where we do pasture walks and tours and education events. That was an awesome grant. It's $40,000. And we put that into our top ground that is so eroded. It's basically just gravel. Like you can't get stepping posts into it. Like you go like half an inch down, it's just like a road. Like there's just no soil. So we used that grant to do bale grazing up there this winter, which got us through that transition period of adding so many head right after a drought. And then our first real tell will be what's my carry capacity this winter. And thus far, we're looking really good. I mean, we're averaging about 2.25 acres a day for the whole herd right now with 820 acres under management. So like, I think we're still understocked. Like we've had good rain so far this spring, but shoot, I mean, I probably have 90 to 95% of my grazable acreage at boot stage or higher of recovery right now, which is just wild.
Yeah, that's awesome. What's your target rest period?
So my target rest period in my grazing acreage is, like I was saying, was like the flag in the warm seasons or the boot in the cool seasons.
Yeah.
And then the other half of the farm is just stockpiled for a whole growing season. So previously, with the like lack of soil fertility and biology that we had when we bought this place from a commercial cattle producer, like 60, 80, 90 days to get back to boot stage. It was kind of slow. Like we had cow pies the first 18 months that just wouldn't break down because the soil was just so dead.
Yeah.
We're getting now to where I'm seeing 40 to 60 days to get back to boot stage, which is awesome. Kind of some of the philosophy that drives this, kind of another piece, ultra high density. Everybody thinks of carbon accumulation as if it's trampled leaf litter or manure. But if you look at the carbon cycle, I would argue that leaf litter manure is only about 20% of the carbon cycle. And this is kind of coming from a lot of Elaine Ingham's research. 80% of the carbon cycle is actually the liquid carbon cycle driven by root exudates. And so that's where, like John Kemp would talk about, work to maximize photosynthesis so that you've got that liquid carbon cycle functioning. So if you look at grasses, right, when a sprout grows, it puts out a little leaf and then it puts a lot of energy into building frame a root. You've got this kind of pie chart of where the energy is going. So it's using up seed energy to do that. And then once it builds enough root, it starts putting on frame and more leaf. The larger the leaf, the larger the solar panel, the more photosynthesis occurring. And so as that photosynthesis is increasing, the pie chart of where the energy is going to frame, and then more and more of it's going to root exudates. And so as photosynthesis is increasing, more and more and more root exudates are occurring. And that's kind of that sigmoid growth curve of grass, where late vegetative, early reproductive is maximal root exudate production. And then when it goes full reproduction, the root exudates shrink down to really minimal. And what's happened there is the plant has been feeding the soil biology. So the soil biology can go out and mine all the trace minerals and everything the plant needs and produce all the compounds the plant needs for as successful as possible reproductive cycle. And so by grazing at a later stage than what most regenerative grazers are targeting, because most are targeting that kind of mid-vegetative for the sake of more energy into the animal, because their animals aren't hardy enough, right? By us targeting a little bit later, being like basically transition phase between vegetative and reproductive, we're putting more energy into the soil than energy into the cow. Now, I need super hardy cows. That goes back to that ultra high density genetics conversation. But we are dumping deep, stable carbon into the soil because the soil biology is taking that liquid carbon and basically manufacturing like humates and like just like mineral associated carbon compounds through the whole root layer deep down into the soil. So it's building tons of fertility really, really quickly. So mixing that grazing cycle that we're doing kind of at transition stage with the long stockpile rest seasons that really go through that whole process, which also allows more of the diversity to grow in during the long rest times, like kind of the forbs to set and grow in, and things to kind of succession of species to come forward and tap roots down. We're driving carbon at a much, much faster rate than a typical regenerative operation does.
Yeah. I mean, this has been a really impressive conversation. Joel, I think we could probably talk for a lot longer, but where could people find you? Is there anything you want to leave us with? What is, I guess, the call to action to our listeners to get in touch with you?
Yeah, let's pick back up the thread of the call to action where I didn't chase all the threads. So what do we do to help advance what you and I care about in the industry? Okay. One, supporting the macro stuff, like with trying to solve Triffin's dilemma. So the tariffs, anything that's helping bring trade balance and production back into the U.S. into balance is useful. Moving us away from the world reserve currency problems like Dutch disease, which is also kind of layered in. It's very similar with the Triffin's dilemma problems. So that's where things like storing value in assets personally and advancing the progress of like, say, hard money. So that's both, say, like gold, and I'd argue even the Bitcoin world and those conversations. That's going to help production in America. So we can support that. And then moving towards ecologically efficient, long time horizon thinking in our systems. So building resilient, adaptable, highly fertile cattle genetics, ultra high density grazing for ecological advancement of the land, and then also showing and building accountability across the industry of ecological and nutrient outcomes to where we overcome the greenwashing and the bad corporate marketing to create incentives where the customer is educated and actually cares about what's being produced, to move the demand towards the right types of cattle and the right types of farms and systems. So that way there is a buyer market where guys like I can actually sell volume that is not taking a giant haircut at the sale barn because we're developing logistics and buyer networks for these types of animals. So from a producer and even from a consumer side, those are all very achievable steps. Other action steps would be awesome. Like, we'd love more support and participation driving forward the work we're doing here. We have, I think, about 60 herd shares available if anybody wants to jump in with us and participate as a stakeholder in our operation. You can find me at smokeriverranch.com. You can find me on Twitter at Smoke River Ranch. I also have a personal Twitter account that's Untapped Growth. If anybody wants to be a part of this, if anybody's working on the science of these things and wants to talk, I would love just to have conversations or have anybody who wants to financially participate that wants to. That's all I really got to say. I mean, if anybody wants to kind of hear more of the big picture stuff too, we published a good article I can plug, and you can link it later in the podcast with the American Tribune. It's called Soil and Money. That's kind of about the history of agriculture in America and the rise and fall of it and where we are, which helps ground decisions and like actually understanding historical context versus being reactionary. That'd be great to have people reading and getting more informed on too.
All right. That's awesome, man. Well, make sure you visit Joel at these websites, and I think we'll probably have some more of Joel involved with Acres in the future here. So thanks for joining us, man. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely loved it, man. Been a pleasure talking. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to the Acres USA podcast, a podcast production of Acres USA. Find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Play, and other popular podcast platforms. Acres USA is North America's oldest publisher on production-scale organic and regenerative farming. For more than 50 years, our mission has been to help farmers, ranchers, and market gardeners grow food profitably, regeneratively, and with nature in mind. Find our books and other Acres USA media and learn about Acres USA events at acresusa.com. Read our online magazine at members.acresusa.com, and we'd like to thank Acres USA staff for their contributions to producing this podcast. This episode was edited and engineered by Weston Larson of Acres USA. We're grateful to our guests for taking the time to talk with us about their experiences.